Hello everyone, this is Akal, and I'm going to talk today about Jyeshtha Nakshatra, the various energies that intertwine in Jyeshtha, meaning the four padas, or the four divisions, as well as the rulership, which is Mercury, and the overarching rulership, which is Mars, because Jyeshtha happens to be at the end of Scorpio. So let me talk a little bit real quickly about Scorpio in general. So Scorpio in general, to me, it is a materially focused nakshatra, meaning it is the last of the 9 nakshatras that are tamasic at their base. And this all began with Magha at the beginning of Leo. So what that basically means is that those 9 nakshatras from Magha to Jyeshtha tend to be, again, focused on material things deeply. Okay, so this is a deep energy, right? So Jyeshtha, in a lot of ways, is about recognizing the sort of, let me back that up. So Scorpio in general is about recognizing the deeper meaning in material pursuits. From the beginning of Scorpio, you tend to have energies which tend to keep achieving, but finding nothing and finding a void. There's an emptiness when they achieve. Vishaka is that energy. It's driven to achieve something and it just feels empty. So in Anuradha, which is the second nakshatra in Scorpio, that particular nakshatra he's able to sort of anchor the sort of spiritual into the material, right? So they're able to work on finding a harmony between the spiritual and the material. And they also can be more flexible in terms of how they're approaching things. So early in Scorpio, I can do it myself. In Anuradha, it becomes much more open to sort of social influence and being, sort of learning and teaching and guiding and, et cetera, et cetera. Now in Jyeshtha, a lot of those qualities that exist in the previous nakshatras still play out here. But what happens here is the dissolution of the personality, the dissolution of the ego. Reminded me a lot of Pisces energy, actually. But when I mean dissolution, it has to do with the conflict, where Pisces may inherently have a detachment kind of energy, that not detachment, but sort of poorly formed egoic structure, we'll say, because Pisces they're not here to exalt the ego. That's not their point. As again, on a spiritual level, on a sort of higher plane understanding, that's not the point of Pisces, is to establish itself as an ego on the material plane. Jyeshtha is to disintegrate the ego on the material plane. So it's very interesting energy. I had a hard time kind of understanding this initially, which is kind of true of all the Scorpio nakshatras for me. So the tug of war here is one's outer expression and one's inner feelings, right? So what is going on within oneself? Because this energy can be very secretive, right? So when you don't know yourself inside, you can kind of hide things away and be secretive and quiet. And so there's something here that can happen, which is an incongruency between one's actions and one's deeper beliefs, right? One's deeper mission. So Jyeshtha is here to bring their sort of outer actions into alignment with their deeper mission. Their deeper mission really is humanitarian, deeply so. It's very protective energy, and again, I'm going back to this idea that Mars rules this. So it is also considered the eldest, right? Now, this term, the eldest, I thought was quite interesting because one of the things I read, it says, okay, well, the eldest is because at one point there were only 18 nakshatras and Jyeshtha was the final one. I'm like, okay, fine. But then I started to think about that and I'm like, actually, this is the eldest amongst the nakshatras as they relate to material plane action and fixation. So meaning this is the point at which the individual spiritualizes, is really driven to spiritualize and to sort of create a sense of detachment from the material things. So some of the words that kept popping up when I was reading about Jyeshtha was poverty, penance, get a bunch of like really uncomfortable words. And it doesn't, and again, the idea here is it doesn't mean that these folks are like monks who have a vow of poverty, that kind of thing. Although that could be taken to an extreme, it could potentially happen. The reality, though, is it has to do with this trial and error process, which, as I perceive Mars, is very trial and error. It's the teenage boy aggressive energy that keeps slamming into things and needing to change course when something doesn't work out. So Jyeshtha has that going on in spades here because they're really here to figure it out, right? So, and as I go through the padas, it'll make a lot of sense. So like I said before, tamasic energy is at its base. And these are the gunas. Those are the fundamental energies which underlie all existence. And just so you know what those are. And so then sattvic energy is kind of on a it's sort of the interpersonal level. And then sattvic energy is what's expressed outwards. So anytime you see the word sattvic, you can think about there being, for me, I always think of a bridge. I think of openness, I think of objectivity, I think of neutrality and clarity. Okay, so that's why this nakshatra is ruled by Mars. So Mars is this level of discernment, objectivity potentially, and it's a levity and it's a light, right? It's very airy. And it's just kind of floating above the material plane, right? So it's floating above that which is solid, the density. And so a couple things can happen here depending on how Mercury is functioning. And again, Mercury is always weighing this or that. So this or that applied to the material plane can lead to a little bit of emotional chaos, right? This is a water sign ultimately, so we have to remember emotions are playing in here. So we have stirred up water potentially here. I cannot make a decision between this and that. So when they do finally perhaps make a decision between this and that, they find that, just like Vishaka at the beginning of Scorpio, they find a dissatisfaction with one's achievements. And then like, let me try this, and they find more dissatisfaction. So there can be that tendency similar to Vishaka. But ultimately, what they're here to do is like, again, keep weighing these things, keep figuring it out until they go, oh, that's it. And it has to do with aligning the lower self with the higher self, the ego self with, let's say, the universal consciousness or God, whatever you want to call it. So that's why Jyeshtha is always, there's other words that get thrown around about Jyeshtha, which is protection. Again, I mentioned the eldest. They tend to be very authoritative. They tend to have leadership abilities. Again, so we think about military, police, protective energies. So, because ultimately, like I said, it's about serving humanity. Now, let me go into the padas, and this will kind of make more sense if I haven't confused you already. So, the first pada, or section of Jyeshtha, is ruled by Jupiter. And I wrote the words levity and hypocrisy. And what it is that I mean by levity and hypocrisy here is this is when the personal struggle, there's a really deep personal struggle that starts to come up in this pada at the beginning of Jyeshtha. And that personal struggle has to do with they're looking for something higher. They understand that there's something higher. Again, because that was like kind of in some ways figured out with Anuradha, the previous nakshatra, is that there was a mission there. And in Anuradha, they really anchored into the mission quite well. Now, in Jyeshtha, though, again, this is about the dissolution of one's personal mission, period. That'll make more sense as we get towards the fourth pada. So, but in this first pada, what we're getting is this sort of high-mindedness that comes. So you can see these individuals being very attracted to occult practices, spirituality. Think Sagittarius, right? So Sagittarius is kind of the first sign, as I perceive it, that is really, really driven by sort of this spiritual, wanting to understand the universal roots of things and the spirituality and the high-mindedness. And again, this is very Jupiter expansive energy. So again, with Jyeshtha, though, we're getting that same sort of thing. So high-mindedness comes in here. Religiosity is the word I'm thinking of. So depending on how deep these individuals go, they can have some lightness. A lot of the energies around Jyeshtha tend to be kind of dense and heavy and uncomfortable. So we're looking at words like, and I have some really unflattering words here. So authoritarian, hypocrite, superficial, meaning that they're overly concerned about their appearances. And I would say that in the beginning here is probably very true. Again, it's immature. This is where the internal personal struggle is really starting to manifest in a deep way. They know there's a mission. They know it. They can feel it on their insides, but they're not quite applying the energy to the outside world quite yet correctly. They're a little bit shallow about it, right? So that's why I wrote hypocrisy. Some of the other words that you might see is vengeful and secretive, and anyway, on and on, some, again, unflattering words. But here, like I said, there's a little lightness to it and a little bit of levity to it. And again, that could lead to some superficiality, but the hypocrisy I'm talking about here would have to do with, like, these are, again, authoritative folks. So these are folks that it could be learned individuals, and that they could be very knowledgeable of, and if they're applying that energy towards high-mindedness, philosophy, or religion, they may not practice what they preach, right? They may do all these superficial, external, religious kind of I'm trying to think of the word, rituals, we'll say. So they may have all these rituals, but they may not necessarily be living the life, right? So, and again with Jyeshtha, we're thinking about the extremes of, and I'm going to bring up right-hand path, left-hand path, and I don't mean this in a political sense. I mean this in the sense of that sort of spectrum of orthodoxy, purity, no drugs, no alcohol, no sex, none of that kind of thing, which would be kind of right orthodoxy. And then you have left-hand extreme path, which is kind of like anything goes, right? So it's anything goes. So Jyeshtha to me is a left-hand path kind of sign, in that they're working through all those sort of scorpionic energies that are associated with sex, drugs, alcohol, wanting to feel things deeply, right? And so anyway, with that first pada, it can be very high-minded, a lot of internal personal struggles around making sure that they're practicing what they preach. Second pada, this becomes uncomfortable because now you have Saturn. Saturn comes in here, and it's I tend to look at Saturn in one of two ways. It's either it's like the angry disciplinarian father who didn't support you, and they were just kind of lashing you and giving you pain, fear, and suffering, right? So that kind of father. And then eventually Saturn can become the kind of father you admire and love. And that's sort of how Saturn evolves. And ultimately Saturn is a spiritualizing planet, so we have to keep that in mind. All the energies here for Jyeshtha are spiritualizing energies, and they simply move from expansion to contraction back to expansion. So again, in the second pada here, we have contraction, and this is the energy of Capricorn. So the associations of Capricorn you often see is this idea of a goat climbing up a hill, and again, it's all this like weight on one's shoulders. So there's a heaviness here. And really what this heaviness is about, it's about the sort of, it tends to slow everything down. So there's a rigidity and a slowness here, which can lend to additional intentionality to things. But that also can mean that they could be very judgmental, they could be very vengeful, and all sorts of things, because they're being rigid, right? So what is the lashback when you're super, super tight and rigid? It's like a defensive posture. So naturally we tend to lash out if, something doesn't go our way, or, we want to control something or somebody. Because the big thing about Jyeshtha Nakshatra is the word control. So what we're moving through with the padas is the movement from more control to less control. The movement from egoic centered action to flow. And so with the second nakshatra here, you're seeing, I wrote down the word transformation. So transformation this is where the ego gets really beaten down. It gets really beaten down. You can hear lots of, like bitching and whining in this particular nakshatra, or this particular pada, but this nakshatra in general can lend itself to that sort of thing. But what ends up happening here, again, is it's sort of like they're trying to attune to the mission. So all this rigidity is needing to be broken down, broken down, broken down, broken down. And they're going to persist. They're going to keep going, keep going, keep going, persist, persist, persist. And again, that Mars energy is always playing in here, trial and error, that's not working, this is working, etc., etc. So again, very strong protective mechanism here. And I wrote down a brief phrase here. In the second pada, it talks about the complete shattering of the personality. So this is where you're going to see traumas rise up quite a bit, potentially. And remember the purpose of a trauma, particularly as it relates to Saturn and the pain, fear, and suffering kind of generalizations that go along with Saturn, is that we're supposed to transcend those things, right? So it's through pain, fear, and suffering oftentimes that we find growth. If we can let go of the bitching and whining, moaning and groaning, and we can stop being a victim. So that's one of the things that happens here. So these individuals are learning to step up, be the protector, to let go of their own personal victimhood. That doesn't sound quite right, but anyway, you get what I'm saying. They have to let go of the victimhood. They have to, again, really rise up, be that example, be exemplary, and lead in a way. So now the third pada, once again ruled by Saturn, different kind of Saturn, like I mentioned before. This is the Saturn that the ego has been really broken down at this point. So there's a level of detachment. And this is the Saturn as it relates to Aquarius. And Aquarius is pretty infamous for being kind of detached energy. And what do we mean by detached? It means air, right? But it's fixed air. It's air that is hovering above the material in a sort of a very fixed way. So there's space. So again, when you have space, you have the potential for objectivity. So what you could have here is folks who are concerned about society. They're concerned about how we organize ourselves, what are better ways to organize ourselves. But their mission, their deeper spiritual mission as it applies to the material plane, is very much about serving the greater good. So that is pretty much the third pada. And again, third pada is like, to me, was kind of a less severe pada. It's less severe, it's less uncomfortable, because I feel like the mission's becoming very clear here, right? Like, they can see, I'm here for service. This is not about me, right? And that's a huge step, moving from material fixation to this is not about me. So the personality, ego structures, all that stuff, breaking down, breaking down, breaking down. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to say about the third pada. Universal welfare. Ultimately, like I said, one's goals. And again, because we have to keep in mind that the Jyeshtha is an Artha Nakshatra, meaning goal-oriented. It is going towards some particular goal. And because it is goal-oriented, the goal in this particular case is not one's personal gain, nor is it to be defensive and to try to prevent losses. It's about, all right, let me move through all the gains and losses towards the deeper spiritual mission, which is once again serving society. It's about sort of universal welfare. Fourth pada. Now we have Jupiter again. So back to expansion, right? So it's Pisces energy here. So this is kind of the nutshell of all of the potential messiness that Jyeshtha can bring. And what I mean by that is that because the influence of Piscean energy here, you're seeing fantasy, illusion, delusion, the sort of this is the pada for self-destruction. If it's going to happen, it can happen in a deep way in the fourth pada here. Because again, with all the illusion, delusion, victimization, things like that. So we're learning in the fourth pada, the victim thing has to go out. It's really getting pushed out. It's coming to the surface. Again, that's a big theme with Pisces, right? Is the blame. It's this projection. I'm blaming everything outside myself because they're operating from a place of illusion and delusion, potentially fantasy. And if you add drugs and alcohol and all sorts of other escapes into that, they never really address the deeper truth. So what happens in the fourth pada is that ultimately they're being, the breakdown here has to do with, again, having all that imagination also allows them to sort of achieve very creatively here. But the mission becomes much more clearly. I actually kind of feel like there's a contentment that comes here because the mission is kind of obvious here. It's about serving humanity. Again, universal welfare on a very, very broad level. And so if they can get past all the self-sabotage, what ends up happening is they can align to that mission. Poverty be damned. They don't care. It's not about that. It's not about poverty. It's about aligning to the sort of one's higher self with nature, the universe's deeper, primal, fundamental functionings, right? So that which is natural law, that which man cannot manipulate and control, that which exists whether we exist or not. So here we go from sort of like this at the beginning of this pada was a lot more about control. It was about sort of controlling the outside world, being religious as opposed to living it, right, or feeling it deeply. And it moved all the way through. We broke down the ego structure, the personality structure, until we get to the final point here, which is about surrender to flow, right? So you can align the flow in the fourth pada. That the potential here is to align the flow totally with one's mission on the material plane. So I think that's all I want to mention here. Let me look at my notes really quickly. Yeah, that's all I really wanted to kind of talk about. So the next nakshatra I'll be doing is Moolah. And Moolah is, in a lot of ways, to me, feels like an extension of Jyeshtha in some ways. And then both of those nakshatras are kind of approaching the sort of galactic center. And that to me is the big void, right? So this is sort of, and it's a deeply, I'm using the word feminine, deeply feminine principle. This idea of a void, and it has to do with like total receptivity. And so what ends up happening as you move towards Moolah, it becomes more about rooting into the understanding of universal functioning, where Jyeshtha, it was about aligning to universal functioning. And so Jyeshtha, the lesson here was how to not misalign with it. Right? If you misalign with the deeper universal functioning, then what ends up happening is pain, fear, and suffering. So with all that said, if you'd like to have your chart read, I would gladly read your chart. I have my website down below the video. And yeah, thank you much. Appreciate it.